Hi, I'm Debbie Ingram, and this is Town Meeting TV's Under the Dome series. I'm hosting a special series called Affordability in Vermont, and we're focusing on taxes, income, and housing costs.
As it comes to taxes, let's think about, could taxes affect affordability in Vermont, right? That's what I've heard a lot from voters very recently, that taxes are high. And to be clear, Vermont has the third highest average state and local taxes in the country. But we need to think about, so that's going to reduce your after-tax resources and your ability to pay for the basic needs. But what are those taxes being used for? That's the other part of the equation, right? So Vermont might have the third highest taxes in the United States, but we're above average in provision of social welfare, of funding for education, of roads, for example. There's an extent to which what we pay taxes for comes back in the services that we receive. And if we care about poverty alleviation, for example, having higher tax rate is helping us alleviate poverty and provide income support for low-income Vermonters.
Because when you look at migration, for taxpayer migration across the states, they're even, right? So there's just as many people coming in as coming out. And they actually go back and forth to a lot of the same states, right? So it's not even like there's all these people moving to Florida. It's like there's a lot of people moving to Florida, and there's a lot of people moving from Florida to Vermont. So the top 10 states that people move to, I think 9 of them are in the top 10 states that people move from. So it's really a wash. And I think it's also just worth noting that in any given year, 96% of taxpayers are staying put. Right, so we're really talking about a little bit on the margins, even just the people who move. Not talking about the people who move for tax reasons, but just the people who move is a very small fraction. Cumulatively over the last 20 years, it's a shift in population of about 3,000, and that's plus 3,000 to Vermont and taxpayers.
What troubles me is the state estate tax. And the estate tax is a tax on the value of all a deceased person's assets. And the reason it troubles me is only 12 states out of 50 have an estate tax. That's less than 25% of the states. And Vermont, of course, is one of those 12 states that has the estate tax. And I don't think it raises a lot of revenue. I'd be surprised if there's 12 or 20 taxable estates in Vermont in a year. And I have had clients leave the state more for the estate tax than the income tax.
That disconnect between, if I make this decision, what is the impact? Or another town might want to spend more, and you end up having to help pay for that decision. And so it's really something that we've got to grapple with, because and it's very hard when you look at that individual budget. What does it all look like in totality? And that's what we're seeing. And that is why people are so concerned around the way in which that education funding works, and that disconnect between fiscal tough decisions and getting some benefit from it.
Personnel costs in general are where the bulk of the education spending is. Healthcare and the significant increases in healthcare costs continue to be, I don't know if they're number 2, but they're a big one. And in the last few years, they've been driving a good chunk of the property tax pressure people have seen. Basically, it's a pool of people, many tens of thousands of people, who are covered in the state, the teacher's health plan. The premiums for them have been going up double digits, just like we've seen throughout the rest of Vermont's economy. And while the teachers themselves bear a portion of that, the school districts pick up roughly 80% of it. So as we've seen those increases in healthcare costs, that's been passed on to taxpayers.
The State of Working Vermont report, one of the things that we look at is wages relative to the costs. And so what we find in Vermont, and this has been true for as long as we've been looking at it, which is 20 years or more, that our costs are pretty much at the national average, and that's a combination of everything. So that's housing, healthcare, sort of all the things put together, are at the national average, but our wages are below average. And the gap in Vermont between the average wage and the average cost is bigger than most states. We have one of the biggest gaps. So that's a problem. And we try to dig into a little bit how much of it is a wage problem, how much of it is a cost problem, and the answer is yes, all of the above.
The housing targets was one provision of Act 181. The other major part was really looking at regional future land use maps and tying those to two state efforts. One on the regulatory side, are there places where we could relieve or reduce Act 250 jurisdiction? So that's the regulatory side. The second part is more on the incentive. So there's been, for a long time, state designation program that has provided tax credits for a property owner that wanted to like rehab a commercial building in a village center. So our maps now will be tied to that designation program directly instead of the town having to negotiate with the state on a map. We'll work with our towns, kind of finalize the map, and then bring it to the state and approve the whole county at once.
If housing costs are the same, but you have 50% less income, then the portion of your income that's going towards housing is substantially more. And we have a term for that in the housing world called cost burdened. And we're concerned about that when it rises above 30% of your total income, and even more so when you're spending more than 50% of your total income for your housing cost. Because again, it leaves you just not enough resources. About 17,000 Vermont renters spend more than half of their income on housing costs. So, and that's about a quarter of all Vermont renters.
We have a program, the Vermont Housing Improvement Program. The thinking behind VHIP is exactly what you laid out, that we have units all over the state that are falling into disrepair. We have structures that could be residential units, but they're just underutilized space right now. Or perhaps folks have a large farmhouse or an old Victorian and they don't need all that space anymore. They'd rather split it up into a duplex or 3 units. VHIP, the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, can do all of those things. So it's grants up to $50,000. The landlord, by accepting the grant, does agree to either 5 or 10 years of affordability.
These are the things, Debbie, that these are the items that people always want to learn more about, all the costs that go into a project. I won't necessarily go through each line item, but this again is based off of kind of real world examples of all the different things that go into just the soft cost side of a project. So we had the soft costs, now construction. I won't go into any of this in detail, but you'll see on this one, it came in around $286 per square foot. Which is actually a little bit on the lower end for today's, rising construction costs. So roughly $5.2 million construction cost. So then the pro forma is going to look at the rental income. So the developer is going to look at projecting what the rental income is going to be. On this example, this is a sample. And it's just kind of an example of one way you can structure the rent. But this is on the higher side of rent, kind of just to show how the higher side is still really challenging with the pro forma.
So I'm going to reframe that long-term growth goal, 802,000, or tripling the rate of housing production. To reach those long-term goals, we just need to grow at 2% per year. 2%, right? So what people can do is start to ask, what can I do in my community to support 2% growth? For a town of 1,000 people, that means welcoming 20 new residents next year, and that would take about 8 to 10 homes. That's a lot less daunting than 150,000, right? And if we can start to think in those incremental ways at a personal scale, at a local scale, in aggregate, that will lead to transformative change.